Welcome to you all. Today is Friday, and as you know, every Friday we have this university colloquium where we invite uh, someone to tell us about the work that they have been doing. And there have been range of speakers who have come this semester. Today we have with us our colleague because Haima Vadlamani works at Azim Premji Foundation, and she has been looking at the impact of pandemic on the urban poor. So that's the theme that she is going to talk about today. Without taking a lot of time, I would like to invite and hand it over to Haima.
A very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much, Himanshu, for that introduction. It is always a pleasure to talk to students, slightly different audience to the kind that we end up speaking to most of our days. This is a topic that is of close interest to all of us. We are going through it, so we all have experiences, thoughts, views, inputs. So I'm hoping that at the end of this sharing, we'll also have a lively discussion and hear all of your thoughts as well. Like the topic says, it is really about the lost, the last, and the least. Before we dive into what did COVID mean for the urban poor, thought it would be useful to quickly understand and have a shared understanding of who we are calling the urban poor. What was the situation before COVID? What was the state of life? What was going on? And then what about COVID? What are its characteristics that made it so devastating? And therefore, when we look at both of them together, what was the cumulative impact of COVID and where are the communities today? So for all the professors, this slide is for you. I hope I get 2 extra points. The gist of this essentially is that poverty is traditionally been defined on income parameters. We all know that. In monetary terms, there are various metrics which peg rural and urban poverty at a certain level. There are also concepts related to absolute poverty, which is the basic conditions of life, versus relative poverty, which looks at a certain, so a broader definition and widening the lens is important when we look at urban poverty. A recent book by Anirudh Krishna, and that is relevant because the study was also in the city of Bangalore and Karnataka largely, called The Broken Ladder, would be an interesting reading to get a very close-up view of what this kind of a lens would mean, and which means that it is not just about having insufficient resources for physical survival, but is also the set of circumstances that prevent full exercise of citizenship, active integration into community, social mobility, and ability to access opportunity and build their life. And I think that is the view that we shall take when we discuss the fact of where the urban poor are today. So it is therefore a long-term, heterogeneous, multidimensional issue. And sadly for our cities, it is also becoming an intergenerational issue because we've been seeing this emerging and growing over the last few decades. A quick snapshot to tell you what the conditions of urban poverty look like. So most of them live in really bad conditions, which generally we understand as slums. We would like to call it informal settlements, but I'm calling it slums because that is very familiar. 2 million children die in informal settlements every year from snake bites and dog bites. By the way, in Bangalore, you have settlements where kids die out of dog bites. It's really sad and shocking. 30 square feet per person in a city, and you can imagine what COVID would look like. Life expectancy in the poorest of settlements, if you take Mumbai, 39 years. 47% children greater than 3 years are malnourished. 52% women suffer violence. 57% of the children below 10 don't get complete immunization. 70% of those less than 18 years recall some incidence or prevalence of child abuse. Staggering, isn't it? So, kaun hai? Who are these people? So, these are people who are invisible. I don't know how many of you manage to go and walk into a slum and actually see who lives there, how do they live, what are their lives like, what is their daily routine. So what has become a cumulative situation that we call urban poor issues, the trigger has been large-scale migration to urban areas. And in fact, all the studies show it's accelerating. By 2050, 50% of India's population is going to reside in cities. That's the alarming fact. And one big component of that is as these people move into the cities, there is in search of livelihoods, in search of aspirational forms of employment, the cities are not really accepting them and enveloping them and including them. So essentially they are treated as non-active participants. There is a high level of non-acceptance. And this we are talking about pre-COVID, by the way. This is the situation that was there pre-COVID. And therefore, they have no voice, they have no presence, they have no participation in governance. They are largely invisibilized. While there is recognition that they all come and build our cities as construction labor, as garment workers, and all vocations, they essentially are missing out of any discussions or any frame. So when you hear about smart cities, sustainable urban development, there is no specific understanding or policy framework or discussions around who are these urban poor who are here either for work or are settled here. So they are completely ignored. The government frames have also been largely focused on how do we resettle or how do we evict? It's all on housing. Whereas the situation of urban poor is far more complex. It is about mainstreaming them. It is about bridging the social divide. It is about helping them build their livelihoods. It is about formalizing their way of life. So it is a broad spectrum of issues, but essentially if you go to the government and say slums, immediately it is either about, okay, they can be resettled over a period of 20 years or they have to be evicted. So unfortunately, it's been very, very narrow. Like I mentioned, no clear view on migrants. We don't know whether they belong here, they don't belong here, they are from here, they're not our people. I've heard all kinds of, framing of migrants whenever I spoke to government or whenever I spoke to even civil society members, including people like us. We know our maids, cooks come from various parts of the country, but we really don't know what they go through after they leave our house and the kind of harassment they face in their daily lives. So, next point refers to that is a complete apathy. There seem to be two economies, and I'm borrowing this expression from Dr. Anirudh Krishna's book, A Dollar Economy versus a Rupee Economy, and Never the Twain Shall Meet. The distances are only increasing, and the apathy was laid out bare in COVID times as well. Various state initiatives, like I mentioned some of them here, have failed to address this issue systematically and holistically. Therefore, if you summarize and look at what has been our view and how have we approached, governments and civil society at large have been convenient apathy, leading to invisibilization, active denial leading to exclusion, and in some cases hostile attitude, leading to illegalization of this large section of population. Let's look at where does that leave the urban poor in terms of vulnerabilities. And when we talk of vulnerabilities, obviously any discussion would be broader. It would look at multiple aspects of their life and living. So the obvious ones are low economic capital. All of us know they are precarious forms of employment, no formal contracts, lots of daily wage labor, lack of access to finance of any institutional form, so the reliance on lenders is high. And there is a high degree of monetization. And what do I mean? When you go to a slum, everything costs a bit of money. Everything is available, but everything will cost money. Charging, there are slums where there is no electrical connection. So there is always that little shop which will charge it for you for 10 rupees. You will get water, a can of water for 150 rupees. So there are many settlements who are living off the grid and who access services and they have to pay cash. In the city, for you to live, you need cash for everything, right? So in villages still there is some amount of going by on neighbors' kindness, but in cities you need the money. We dwelt on the government apathy and hostility, low degree of empowerment. Here there is a sharp contrast that you will see between the rural and the urban poor. The rural poor have some visibility of the government, of the Panchayati Raj institutions, the Sarpanch, who are the members, Panchayat members. And similarly, the Panchayat has some view of who are the people living in the village, who are the bottom 10%, who do not have the land, who are the single, women-led households. But in the city, they just have no idea. The people living have no idea who is the corporator. I don't know how many of you here know the corporator of your ward. And vice versa. It's just a voting bank. Therefore, if they are settled and have a voter ID, the politician will see some value in coming to them once in 5 years. Otherwise, even that is useless. So if you are a seasonal migrant or a temporary migrant, well, we don't know you are here. Therefore, there is no process of including them in governance, of participation, of voice. And therefore, accountability is also very low in urban governance. Low human capital, I'm going in the reverse direction, I think. Low human capital, needless to say, the kind of living conditions, high incidence of illnesses, high prevalence of malnutrition, poor education and poor linkage to any formal employment opportunities, a lot of addiction and abuse to substances, which is prevalent more in some communities than the other, very low skills, and overall very low degree of human capital. That is in fact one of the key reasons why mobility of escaping out of that poverty becomes just so difficult for the urban poor. Combined with all this is low social capital, low cohesion. People come and live in the city from various geographies, areas. They tend to be, living along with people of their own community or region, but it's a lot more individualistic than what you would see in the rural setting. So they do feel all alone. There is no safety net. There are no deep relationships that they can rely on in times of emergency. And there is a high segregation by religion, by region. You go to large settlements where, say, there are 5,000 households. You actually have people from different regions living together in different parts of that particular settlement. And the minorities, also live in spaces which, over a period of time and due to systemic discrimination, are rapidly getting ghettoized as well. So there is, this is the kind of mix and this is the kind of situation that it creates complex and multi-layered levels of vulnerability. Out of the urban poor, which is like, everybody who is living in conditions of deprivation, be it physical, be it opportunities, be it ability to engage in and participate actively in society, you actually have some particularly vulnerable categories. And the reason why I'm calling them out is because these categories of people, these communities of people suffered even more during COVID than others. Of course, all of them struggled and suffered. Homeless migrants, street children, and those abandoned, and mentally ill. Rat pickers, manual scavengers, transgender and sex workers, people with disabilities. working women, adolescent boys and girls, informal sector workers, migrant workers in unorganized sectors, and children below 12 years. Just to give you a snapshot of the conditions that people live in general, this is in Bangalore. It is a 20-year-old slum called Deepanjali Nagar. I mean, it's really difficult walking through it without really feeling totally depressed. So this is Vinayak Nagar. There is still open defecation. There is no toilet. Electricity is drawn from the pole in a manner that is not legal. In fact, somebody got electrocuted and lost an arm because in the rains one wire had fallen and they had not seen. So that is the kind of precariousness. Community of rat pickers and waste pickers. This is an extremely vulnerable community. There are many who live on private lands. They come into the city. A contractor brings them in, puts them onto a construction site, and there is a deal that is struck on a private land, and then for some rent and for some basic facilities, this is how they live. So typically they pay about 1,000 to 1,500 for the accommodation. Then for water and others, there are extra charges. So they end up spending about 2,000 to 2,500 just for the basic dwelling, which is essentially a room with all these tin, covering of some kind, and a blue tarpaulin in most cases. You would have seen all these at various construction sites. Just pause and watch next time and pay attention, because we pass by these things even in our neighborhoods. Just to give a sense of individual level vulnerabilities, this is a person who is hearing and speech impaired by birth, no one to interact with, and she spends most of her day with birds. So the disabled are extremely lonely, abandoned, and end up being mentally ill. A class 2 student who has to fill up water every day for her family's daily needs for cooking and washing after she comes back from school. Poor access to clean drinking water. Imagine the summers in COVID. Wash your hands and, people are saying, where is the water? This is in Noida. They have to go by, both parents are away, and many times these are the schools or classes that people attend in their own neighborhoods. Because a lot of girl children are held back to take care of the younger ones, and so they cannot attend schools like the others. And many of them also accompany their parents for rat picking and other jobs that the parents go to. This is about Mahesh, father of 4, selling Belpuri. This is in Mumbai. Meager earnings of 200 a day on a good day. So, such difficult lives, burdened and frustrated. 70% of the men and youth turn to alcohol or substance abuse of some kind for refuge. And life expectancy is between 39 to 50 in most of these settlements. And this is the last snapshot, just give a sense of how difficult it is for girls and women. They get married early, and they have long working hours. They try to earn some livelihood as well, and in this case, selling spices. She is now grounding some spices outside the house. The living space itself is so small. Childbearing, rearing, housework. I think women are bearing the biggest brunt of conditions that urban poor live in. So that is really the situation that urban poor lived in before COVID came. So that's how it was. That's how dire the situation already was. When we come to COVID, I just wanted to share very quickly our understanding on COVID came from our direct experiences on the ground. Azim Premji Foundation, from the beginning of COVID, which is March of 2020, started working at various levels across the country. Some quick numbers here to show that our humanitarian support reached over 1.3 crore people across 27 states and 3 union territories. We also had support to regenerate livelihoods for small and marginal farmers, and also look at support for Narega across multiple states, because that became important as other sources of livelihoods disappeared. And we also built an integrated healthcare support. It means support to the frontline, to the communities, support in the intermediate levels like COVID care facilities, also at the tertiary level with hospitals, and support on equipment, support for doctors, and various kinds of other support at the tertiary level. So it was support in an integrated way. And our vaccination program is currently undergoing. It is intensive effort across 2,687 PHCs, reaching out to about 7.25 crore population. And this will continue into the next few months as well. With respect to Bangalore city, where I'm deeply involved along with colleagues from university, our colleagues from the field, as foundation, our response started very early, last week of March, as soon as the lockdown got announced. We mobilized, and our response included reaching dry rations and ready meals to close to 10 lakh people in the city, and similar numbers in the second lockdown this year. Integrated COVID emergency support to 7 lakh vulnerable populations in over 500 slum settlements. Working with NGOs and 1,000 frontline workers. The vaccination work is in progress with about 117 primary healthcare centers out of the 197 centers that we have in Bangalore and peri-urban areas. So I draw from the observations. We have done multiple studies as well. One study is just, the data collection is just got over on how the communities stand today on COVID, post the two waves. So the engagement has been multi-stakeholder, working with BBMP, which is our municipal corporation, working with various government departments, of course, our core foundation team, with the primary health centers who became the fulcrum of effort, and particularly so now in vaccination work. Very committed, motivated, and socially driven partners that we have, 23 of them. And of course the community at the center whom we are serving on COVID support. So drawing from that, I said, staying with the fact that it'd be good to understand. So there's an interesting book by Chinmay Tumbe on the pandemics, and that will be an interesting read as well. So when we all are shocked, we all were actually shocked when the pandemic came, and we didn't know how to react, we didn't know what a pandemic meant. But actually the concept of a pandemic has already ravaged our planet many times in the past. It's just that the way we read our history is so intertwined with our own colonial history, the First World War, Second World Wars, and all that, that I think there is a collective amnesia in terms of the fact that as recently as early 1900s we had a huge pandemic. So India has seen multiple pandemics in the past. Influenza pandemic, which is the 1918-1920 period, India had 20 million people who lost their lives. So we've seen pandemics, and we've seen the worst of them. Why is COVID so devastating? Of course, what is a pandemic is something that none of us remember. So therefore, we were all discovering it for the first time. The reason why a pandemic and COVID, which is a pandemic, is devastating is because it hits at the very core of our life. The way our daily lives, the way our systems, the way our structures have evolved over time, it is built on social interaction and movement. And when that is hit, we're looking at a cascading effect on everything we do and how we live. Non-familiarity with pandemics leads to fear and anxiety. Every country, from governments to citizens, were learning on the go. Migrants, who are an invisible population, no one really realized, and I think it came as a shock to many governments that there were so many migrants in their city. They never really understood how the numbers grew, and when they started walking back, they said, oh my God, these are all from our city. So the sheer numbers were staggering and took everyone by surprise. They knew that the migrants were there, but they didn't know where, and they didn't know how many. And they certainly didn't know the conditions. Multiple waves, that also created a huge uncertainty, because When it started, we all thought complete lockdown, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, you're inside the house. And lo and behold, we are done and we are back. And then the cases started, and then we said, oh my God. So then the first wave, and then we said, okay, now it's done. And then we started getting back to our lives. So it was like, that was another thing that really hit everyone. It was just the stress of not knowing what was going to happen, how many more waves. Even as we stand today, we have not much idea whether it is the beginning of the end or end of the beginning, or where we are in that whole curve. So that is really distressing as well. Government measures, of course, all of us struggled, but to the poor, it really hit at the core of their livelihood activities. They were forced to stay indoors in very cramped places. So these lockdowns, restrictions are a lot more traumatizing for the poor. Also, a lot of media, fake news, misinformation, myths, stigma, it all created huge panic. Even now, hesitancy in some pockets is largely due to some kind of misinformation related to vaccines. So therefore, when you look at a situation where the poor are not visible, a pandemic that has ravaging impact, the situation therefore for the urban poor is extremely therefore devastating. Let's quickly capture the COVID timeline so that we know what kind of duration are we talking about of this prolonged crisis. So the first cases were reported in January 2020, I think 3 nurses who came back from Wuhan. That's how it started. By 23rd, we had complete lockdown. Then the lockdown started easing slowly. But then by September, we had the first wave in full swing, 90,000 cases a day. Then by January, things started slowing down again, and the restrictions were lifted again. And the migrants started slowly returning back to the cities. We had done a study at that time. I shall draw from that study when I speak later. But then, by March, the second wave began. And this was so much more devastating in so many ways that left us totally, facing a situation that was quite incomprehensible. All of us have lost somebody dear. There was not a family that was not touched in one form or the other. Lakhs of lives lost. I mean, we are still arguing whether it's 4 lakhs or 40 lakhs, but the fact is many, many lakhs of lives lost, many families devastated. And there are many who are still struggling from post-COVID complications. Then by late April, India led the world in new and active cases. By 30th April, we became the first country to report 4,000 cases on a single day. Of course, the wave then receded slowly. The vaccination program started picking up speed from 2021. It started in January, but there was a huge availability issue till August. Finally, those got resolved, and it is towards July and August that vaccination efforts started in earnest. And by December, we have 80% of our population, eligible population, who have got 1 dose, and 40.5% who are fully vaccinated. So we were looking at a situation where most restrictions were lifted 2-3 weeks ago. But now we have another new variant of interest. Cases are slowly rising, and we are now again in a state of, trying to figure out what next. When we look at impact, of course, the first and the most easiest is to map out the economic impact. And here I'm drawing from the CMIE study, where you look at the deciles, the bottom 10% of the population, and 10 is the top 10% of the population. When you look at 2019 numbers, which is the first column, and then the second column, which is the 2020 numbers, they are per capita monthly incomes. If you look at the drop in incomes, you look at the bottom. I mean, their incomes have practically got wiped out. 83% drop. I mean, so this tells you not just the devastating impact of the pandemic on the incomes of the poor, it also tells you the huge level of inequality that exists and how inequality is actually increased in the pandemic, which is a separate subject of its own. But just look at the poor. Loss of lives, huge health impact, loss of employment. When you say loss of employment, it hides many other disguised parameters. So they lost a job, Somebody has a job but doesn't have as many days of work. Somebody has a job but days of work but doesn't have the same wages that they had before. Somebody has a job but doesn't have the same job that they had before. So, you know, they all, a car driver is now actually a Swiggy boy. Or there's one who was actually sweeping the streets. They got into vegetable vending, you know, trying to go by. Women more affected than men. Of course, devastating impact for migrant workers. They really didn't know whether to go or to come back or whether to stay back or, you know, so that continues even now. And this is really the time when migrants are back in the cities after the Kharif crop and the work in the villages is done. Usually after Diwali is when they, you know, migrants come to cities. And again, here we are thinking about another wave. Families report 100% families, and these are the study I quote from the study we did in Bangalore. 28% families reported that they haven't had 2 square meals a day. 35% of the families don't have PDS cards. And this is something that we really carried very strongly to the government as well. You know, we said those who applied should be given ration and fresh applications should be accepted, and therefore on the system if the application shows they should be given ration. And all kinds of solutions and suggestions were made to ensure that everybody gets their ration, although it was just cereals. There was no pulses, there was no oil, there was nothing else. And increased casualization. Even those who had fixed salaried jobs slipped back into daily wages and unsure jobs. I don't know how much of this you can see, but just to give a quick number reference for the situation in Bangalore. Some kind of identification available. If you see ration card, it's only 64% of the people. So therefore, a lot of people don't have ration cards. That tells you the issues of related to food security, especially in a pandemic when there are no wages. The one on the top right essentially talks about the kind of habitation and the kind of people who are either permanent in the city or they have migrated. So you see the number of people who are migrants in the city. Staggering again, 38%. None of the official records or data show migrants' populations. So if you ask and look at official sources of data with our municipal corporation or with the government, you will actually see that there are half that number in the slums, because the slum itself is not recognized. The settlements are not recognized. They are very small habitations in many cases. So that was a struggle where the government was scrambling during COVID even to, you know, reach the rations, because they didn't know. You go to Kariyaman Agrahara, which is a large area, there are 10,000, 15,000 households living there, and there is absolutely no idea. So the Mahadevpura zone under which it comes, for example, the official would get 10,000 packets, but the question is he actually needs 50,000 packets. So that's the kind of situation that you had, where the official estimates and provisioning and planning was at a level which was not matching with actually the people who are there on the ground. Of course, the result being that most of them didn't get. Whether you received institutional support or not is the table that you see, the graph that you see on the left bottom. Needless to say, many of them are informal, in informal employment. So no support from any institution. The kind of institutional support that you see there are largely, say, sanitation workers who are somehow still taken care of. You know, an Anganwadi worker or an Asha worker, these are all who live. They have some level of support, you know, that they received, but most others didn't. And if you look at the kind of employment that I was mentioning earlier, jobs lost due to COVID, health issues or any other issue, 15%. New job with same or less pay, 10%. Same job with same or higher pay, 6%. Same job but break in employment is 23%. Same job but less pay is 46%. Essentially, everyone got affected. It's just a question of degree. Quick look at, again, I'm referencing the study that we did in Jan-Feb in Bangalore. Across all kinds of occupational categories, street vendors, food vendors, waste pickers, sex workers, domestic workers, garment sector workers, construction sector workers, and migrants. Not only is the job loss very significant, The outlook is also very confusing. You know, see, like I said, the uncertainty created its own stress and created a huge vulnerability of its own. Everyone was unsure whether to go back to the village, whether to stay back in the city. If you went back to the village, should you come back or should you stay back? What would you do if you stayed back? So it created a spiral of, you know, stress, anxiety, and vulnerability. Just a few key aspects I wanted to focus on so that the situation becomes clearer. Let's look at children, one constituent of the urban poor. We all know the impact on education. There are studies after studies by our own colleagues and in the university. And I think you should all access the resources on the website and go through them. They're extremely revealing in terms of the way they throw light on truth. Increase in dropouts. Those who are attending have seen huge learning losses and staggering learning losses. There are also migration-related disruptions. You know, they were attending a school, but now they've gone back to the village and they have not come back. There are many who are in that category, at least 20 to 30% of the students. There are some in slums who have just not come back at all. So the whole little school that was set up over there by the early child care and education kind of school has none now. So there are many losses at various levels which are embedded in that sentence, in that sense. And 14 plus girls, a lot of girls are not coming back. Either they are married or they are now dedicated to home care, or, you know, they've just been told, okay, now you can stay back. So there is within that a gender dimension as well. A lot of children entering paid work. Again, this has been validated by many studies. Because of no school, they're hanging around. No livelihoods. In any case, why don't you go and earn something? So incidentally, Karnataka government has done a study and they're seriously looking at this issue in terms of sudden increase that you see of children near traffic lights in Bangalore. And, you know, selling wares, begging. This wasn't the case 3-4 years ago. It had drastically reduced in the last 4-5 years. But post-COVID, again, it's a phenomenon that you see increasingly. That tells a story. Increase in abuse and violence at home. You know, everybody is cramped in that small space, lockdown, stress, frustration. And who is at the receiving end? The weakest in the house, which is the children. Increase in child marriage. Across board, there is an increase on calls on helplines. A lot of mental issues for various children because of a combination of these reasons. Of course, needless to say, nutrition took a severe beating. No midday meals, which was really their wholesome meal for the day. When there was nothing enough, you know, to put on the plate for 2 square meals, of course, everybody suffered, children particularly so. And there are children who needed critical attention with illnesses. You know, COVID just took away all the bandwidth of the healthcare system. So they just had to suffer, you know, really deeply. In the initial phase, with the first wave and the lockdowns, there was a disruption of immunization as well, across board. So there was about 20 to 30% lag in the immunization that happened at the PHCs because they were just told to reprioritize COVID and do testing. They just did not have the resources to be able to do both. But of course, the system then got a grip on itself and augmented the resources, and certainly in the case of Karnataka, I can say that. So into the November period of last year, they kind of started driving both simultaneously. Now, the heartbreaking stories are of COVID orphans. We are still understanding the scale and size of the problem. The last numbers we heard are about 1.2 lakh to 1.5 lakh orphans in the country, but we all know that is an underestimate. They have not even been identified. And every story that comes is gut-wrenching on how the kids are going by and their daily lives are. And while there are announcements of government funds, there are so many conditions when you go into it that the person will get when the person reaches 18 years, all kinds of things. Finally, the kid is, 11 years old and he or she has nothing today and doesn't have an idea where the next meal will come. Children in shelters, street children particularly vulnerable. The shelter homes have either stopped or restricted admissions because of COVID. There is also a policy to try and send back as many children as possible to their homes where identifiable and where children have homes. But the situation at the home is not as good as well. So therefore, children are left, literally in a difficult space. Again, the children's homes also saw a lot of kids under stress and mental illnesses, helplines with calls, children with suicidal tendencies. It was very, very difficult. It's been very difficult for the last 1 year with respect to children and the kind of impact that this pandemic has had on every aspect of their life. It's been completely displaced, and they've been completely disrupted. Let's look at women and girls. Loss of work, needless to say, of all domestic workers, government factory workers, home-based workers, sex workers. And somehow getting back into work has been more difficult for women than men, even when the restrictions eased. Again, study after study pointed out that for various reasons related to the fact that either there are children who are still at home because the schools hadn't started till recently, you needed somebody to take care. Then there were issues related to, if you are at an age where you might have a comorbidity, I'd rather take a younger person because, employers are preferring younger people, so the older women never got back into work, including domestic servants. There was a clear discrimination and, there on that as well. Dramatic increase in domestic violence and abuse that was reported across India in urban and rural, but particularly the incidence is higher in the urban poor. Huge issues in mental health. Again, an issue that has increased calls on all helplines. All organizations and the government were left grappling for resources to deal because it's not something that you can build and scale very quickly. While the system was coping with providing services and support to all populations, the pregnant mothers, the pregnant women and lactating mothers were severely affected due to lack of services, and the stress that is caused in that phase of one's life, you cannot even quantify. Child marriage has gone up. It is at 21%, which is at an all-time high for the last 2-3 decades. So that's another pointer to how structurally, how gains that we've made in the last 2 decades have all suddenly been lost in just a matter of 12 to 18 months. Child sexual abuse witnessed, including incest. So see, a result of all this tells you the kind of situation that COVID has imposed again on the women and adolescent girls. When you look at the particularly vulnerable populations, you would see that people with disabilities, because the caregivers, the institutions closed down or they were not accessible because of restrictions. In any case, we know that people with disabilities are highly more vulnerable to COVID than others. So, there was another layer of distress there. Transgender population suffered not just a complete loss of livelihoods. They are also a very small community. They're very dispersed. So, it's not very much a voice and agency that they have in being able to get attention. So, they kind of got ignored in any kind of support, and they was left scrambling even for meals. I mean, I remember when we were doing the humanitarian work and we were trying to reach out these dry ration packs, people just started crying. It was that difficult. And they are not into begging. They are not into, they were conducting their livelihoods, they were earning and they were eating. And, the situation just reduced them to stand in a line. And it is something that is, intrinsically so distressing for anyone. Elderly poor, of course, get deprioritized whenever there's a situation of lack of food, especially if they are not earning anything, suffer a much higher abuse. That has been reported as well. Shelters and old age homes got closed down. And needless to say, huge amount of health issues, mental health issues reported across all these populations. So concluding, Couple of slides on us to reflect on. What has this revealed? I think as a society, it has brought to light the fact that we have ignored and invisibilized the urban poor, and so collectively have failed them as a society. And therefore, there is a need to deeply introspect, go back into our conscience and see, we were in a place where we couldn't provide a meal to our neighbor. The government system's negligence for decades, it was completely exposed that they were caught without any understanding of the urban poor, and no holistic, comprehensive approach to saying how do we deal with COVID in slums. It took, even now when I say the last and the least, they ask even whatever it is, whether it is bed allocation, whether it is vaccination, it is after the top 50% are done that the government says, okay, now where are the slums? It's always like that. Precariousness of lives and livelihoods. I mean, we thought that there were gains made, people were coming out of poverty, and now suddenly when you look at the numbers and people who have slipped back into poverty, that tells you how tenuous these whole gains were, and how we were possibly sitting in a illusion that things were improving, at least on the income side. But we realize now that it is not just the money that can slip back so quickly. We need to look at it rather differently. So the impact on the poor, there is a quantifiable indicator, a set of indicators, and there are those that we can never quantify. The migrant who did not have food for 3 days, who said, I came to the city and now I have to walk back. I mean, I don't know how you could quantify a scar on the child's life, that the child who suffers abuse at home. So I think the pandemic is now, after 18, 19 months of it, and we don't know how many more months, it's very clear it's not just a health issue. It's much, much larger. And it's clear that we don't have an imagination for migrants, and who is a migrant? There are migrants who call themselves migrants who are here for 20 years, and there are people who call themselves migrants because they come here 3 months a year. So we just need a comprehensive definition, understanding, frame, and a holistic, inclusion into our lives in our cities. Looking ahead, recovery, any thinking on quote-unquote recovery, how do we recover from the pandemic, I think needs to include all these dimensions. The impact has been pretty wide, and a spectrum of issues have to be addressed. Like I said, we need to think about how do we build resilience. It is not just building back livelihoods and getting back income levels and getting back a job. There are so many, this is one kind of shock event. There could be many others. We might have another pandemic, we never know. How do we build resilience into all our work in the way that we are thinking about all aspects of life? Reimagining our cities, clearly, if this is not exposed, then I don't know what else we have to wait for. We have to look at making them inclusive, equitable, and just. Basic conditions of life and living should be assured. So we should have minimum rights in terms of whether it is incomes, whether it is amenities and conditions of life. It's time to talk about, let's at least assure that. Particular attention to children and youth so that it doesn't become intergenerational, that 30 years later, people who are currently living in these conditions in urban poor, again, are in the same state as they grow older. And clearly, bridging the divide in the society, it's for everyone to walk across, understand each other better, and making the cities belong to everyone. Last slide, just leaving you with some voices from the field, from people who are living in the informal settlements. I will not read it out, possibly you could just, if it's visible, then, is it visible to all of you? Okay, you could just read it. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
So we'll start the question and answer now. but if you allow me a moment, because like March is usually the month that, like many of us are traveling. And we as teachers were traveling to Nagpur. And by the time when we had to decide to travel to Nagpur to interview, there was already this pandemic. In January, cases were reported from Kerala, etc., etc. And there are people whom we met in Nagpur, whom we interviewed, sitting in this room, probably, and you know that if we would have stayed in Nagpur till 25th of March, there was no coming back. So, another one small anecdote, which is like this invisibilization story that Haima has told us, and the kind of ignorance that many of us knowledgeable carry amongst us. Like, I had tough time convincing journalist friends that actually there is a lot of money for building and other construction workers' welfare if the state cared. And they had no idea how much unspent money the state governments all around the country, union territories, had accumulated because it was decades of unspending of the workers' welfare fund. Over to you, Srijan, for the first question, and then I hope there would be more.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the lecture. In our syllabus, we also have a reading regarding this, Jean Bremen. So, the impact of pandemic on footloose labor. So, it also mentions about how there is intentional kind of thing to make them invisible and ignore the migrant and footloose labor. With the industries as well as with the states, there is a whole, like with the donor states, the states who sent the migrant force to the host states. So I wanted to know what is the idea behind that. Of course, there is like they do not want the accountability. Of course, the state does not want that. As well as the industries must be having some sort of profit with that, providing them benefits and all. So this is intentional, right? Because it has been intentional, they are not documented, they are not recognized in that.
Correct. I mean, it is structural in that sense. It is convenient for the employer to not have a contract, not have obligations and social security, because then you can use them for 3 months, 5 months, and then say, okay, I don't need you anymore. It is therefore the profitability of those operations is the way it is, and therefore it becomes attractive to pursue those work in cities. So the construction work, the large scale labor that is brought from various states for that. Informal arrangements help everyone, the ones with the money, they're very happy with informal arrangements. Tomorrow if the maid were to come and say, I want to formalize my contract and this is my PL and this is my sick leave, and I mean, it's time to introspect. One is the government and the powers that be, and they're all in cohorts. As a system, they have, marginalized and they benefit from keeping it informal. But it is also a question for each and every one of us. We all benefit from keeping it informal. It's fine, they have to come every day, and once they go out of a house, whether it's a plumber, we have no idea. We're fine with that, right? So I think it's a question to deeply ponder. And of course, it's a structural question. It's become a large structural question. It requires a comprehensive addressing. So the state from which they come from, what is it they come with? The state in which they come into, it has to be structured. It can't be left to the devices of individuals or people. And certain basic conditions have to be assured as a right.
मैम, कोविड के जो इम्पैक्ट है उसको आप कास्ट या किसी रिलीजन को लेके किस तरह से देखती है? जैसे कि दिल्ली में जो तबलीग जमात का जो इंसिडेंट हुआ था और जिस तरीके से फिर मीडिया ने उसको एक अलग लेवल पे दिखाया था, और उसका जो फिर जो रूमर्स फैलाए गए, जैसे कि मैं मेरे डिस्ट्रिक्ट का बताता हूँ, तो जैसे कि लोगों ने मुस्लिम पीपल को बायकॉट कर दिया कि हाँ, इनसे कोई सब्जी नहीं खरीदेंगे, ना इनसे कोई बातचीत करेंगे, और बहुत सारे गांवों में उनको मारा गया, पीटा गया। तो एक कास्ट या रिलीजन के ऊपर किस तरह से इम्पैक्ट हुआ कोविड का, तो आप क्या बोल सकती है इस पे?
नो, दैट इज स्टिल गोइंग ऑन। ये तो अभी भी ये जो कास्ट और रिलीजन के लेंस से देखने वाली बात है, वो जब भी कोई क्राइसिस आती है उस वो लेंस और भी लगाया जाता है, किसी चीज़ पे भी हो। तो कोविड इज़ नॉट डिफरेंट, तो उसमें भी वो प्ले आउट किया इन मैनी वेज। इफ़ यू टेक बैंगलोर वेयर वी आर वर्किंग क्लोजली, ये पैंडमिक ऐसा रहा कि आपको प्राइमरी हेल्थ सेंटर से सर्विसेज लेना बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है, क्योंकि प्राइमरी हेल्थ सेंटर वॉज द फल्क्रम ऑफ द एफर्ट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट। लेकिन इतने सालों से इतना in terms of just the trust of communities in that center, क्योंकि आप वहाँ जाते हो, आपका एक तरह से डिसरेस्पेक्टफुली ट्रीट किया जाता है, और आप एक कम्युनिटी से हो तो भी एक और एटीट्यूड भी है उसका, तो वो ट्रस्ट बना ही नहीं। तो अगर आप आज जाके बोलेंगे कि आप प्राइमरी हेल्थ सेंटर उस गली में है और आप जाइए और वैक्सीन लगाइए, वो तो बोलेंगे हम ट्रस्ट नहीं करते हैं वो प्राइमरी हेल्थ सेंटर को, आप यहाँ पे आके हमको लगा लीजिए, हम जाएंगे नहीं। ये तो सिस्टमैटिकली हुआ ना, दिस काइंड ऑफ लैक ऑफ ट्रस्ट, एपैथी हैज बीन डन इन अ टारगेटेड वे। अभी इस माहौल में सीएए के बाद हुआ, जैसे 2020 जब मार्च में मुस्लिम पॉपुलेशन इन द सिटी वाज ऑलरेडी इन अ सर्टेन फ्रेम ऑफ एंजाइटी एंड फियर। अब जब कोविड के पहले केसेस आए थे यहाँ बेंगलोर में, पादरायणपुरा एक ऐसा वार्ड है जहाँ पे मुस्लिम पॉपुलेशन ज़्यादा है, तो वहाँ पे ऑब्वियसली इट वाज अ स्टैंड ऑफ, क्योंकि उसको वो लॉकडाउन के वजह से उसको कंटेनमेंट जोन किया गया था। अब कंटेनमेंट जोन किया, एवरीबडी वाज अंडरस्टैंडिंग व्हाट वाज अ कंटेनमेंट जोन। किसी को आने नहीं दिया जा रहा था, जाने नहीं दिया जा रहा था, उनके मतलब खाना भी, वेजिटेबल्स भी नहीं आ पा रहे थे। तो इट क्रिएटेड अ ट्रस्ट एकदम जीरो है। एक तो फियर है, ट्रस्ट की बात नहीं है। किसी को कोविड हुआ भी, उनको ले जाना भी मुश्किल था, कोविड केयर सेंटर तो किसी को भी जाना नहीं था। तो I think the way that caste and religion played out in this case is that they are left even more vulnerable than others. There are many filters that got played out. For example, humanitarian aid में politician ने उन लोगों को राशन दिया जिन्होंने वोट किया उनको, या किसी पार्टी को दिया, और किसी, मतलब ये तो सरासर inhuman and cruel। तो इस तरह के मल्टीपल लेंसेज, इंक्लूडिंग द कास्ट लेंस, द रिलीजन लेंस, in a crisis like this, that makes it even more difficult to, yeah.
हेलो, गुड आफ्टरनून मैम। एक क्वेश्चन था कि व्हेन वी लुक एट द हिस्ट्री ऑफ माइग्रेशन वर्कर, देयर इज अ लॉन्ग हिस्ट्री बिहाइंड दैट, बट टिल नाउ वी आर इन 2021, बट जब हम देखते हैं कि इतने सालों से माइग्रेशन एक स्टेट से दूसरे स्टेट की ओर जा रहे हैं, या जैसे कि अगर हम बात करें नॉर्थ ईस्ट स्टेट से, कर्नाटका या केरला बहुत ही ज़्यादा माइग्रेट होते हैं, लेकिन अभी तक में ऐसा क्यों गवर्नमेंट की तरफ से, ना होस्ट गवर्नमेंट की तरफ से, ना जिस स्टेट से माइग्रेशन हो रहे हैं वहाँ में क्यों ऐसा मैकेनिज्म नहीं बनाया गया है कि माइग्रेंट वर्कर को ट्रैक किया जाए, कितने लोग बाहर हैं, कितना। अगर हम वेस्ट बंगाल की बात करें, वेस्ट बंगाल का गवर्नमेंट शुड टेक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी दैट हाउ मेनी पीपल्स आर माइग्रेटिंग टू केरला, बैंगलोर, और एट द सेम टाइम कर्नाटका ऑल्सो टेक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी दैट हाउ मेनी पीपल्स आर कमिंग फ्रॉम विच स्टेट। सो जैसे कि हम लोगों ने एक वल्नरेबिलिटी सिचुएशन देखा पेंडेमिक के समय में कि इतने सारे अचानक से जब लॉकडाउन लगा तो सब जगह भीड़ हो गए, है कि नहीं, और कोई एक नंबर का अंदाजा नहीं था कि कितने नंबर के माइग्रेंट्स है, कि मतलब कितने लोग हैं, किस स्टेट से है। तो अगर इस तरह का मेजर अगर लिया जाएगा तो कहीं ना कहीं एक, अगर ऐसा नहीं कि एक बार हुआ तो नेक्स्ट नहीं होगा, नेक्स्ट भी हो सकता है। जैसे कि फर्स्ट पैंडेमिक हुआ, फिर भी हम लोगों ने, अगर गवर्नमेंट की बात करें तो बहुत सारे नेग्लिजेंसी हुआ गवर्नमेंट, इसलिए सेकेंड वेव में वो ज़्यादा वल्नरेबल हुआ। फिर भी गवर्नमेंट क्यों स्टेप नहीं ले रही है इस विषय में कि ट्रैक किया जाए? क्योंकि माइग्रेशन तो होंगे, लेकिन माइग्रेशन होने के बाद अगर कुछ प्रॉब्लम होता है तो प्रॉब्लम को कम करने के लिए कुछ तो मेजर क्या बोलते एक्शन स्टेप लेना चाहिए। लेकिन अभी तक क्यों नहीं लेते? क्या ये विलिंगली नहीं लेते हैं या फिर उसके पीछे है कि नहीं? क्योंकि अगर स्टेप ले रहे हैं तो अलग एक मिनिस्ट्री बनाना पड़ेगा उनके लिए, है कि नहीं? तो क्यों नहीं, ये इतना बड़ा प्रॉब्लम होने के बावजूद भी गवर्नमेंट क्यों एक्शन नहीं लेता है इसमें?
So I wish I had a simple answer to that question of क्यों कुछ इतना important मुद्दा है और हमने crisis अपनी आंखों से देखा है. I think the most enduring images of COVID for us is the migrants walking back, and that's I think it requires multiple departments also to sit together. So therefore this intent of working on migrants, देखिए एक migrants ऐसा है, I think it requires a definition also, because हम लोग को इतना आदत हो गया, लोग विद इन द मतलब मैसूर से यहाँ आ रहे हैं, पेरी अर्बन एरिया से आ रहे हैं, फिर विद इन कर्नाटका आ रहे हैं, फिर आउट ऑफ स्टेट से आ रहे हैं, जो साउथ इंडियन स्टेट से वहाँ से आ रहे हैं, नॉर्थ इंडियन स्टेट से आ रहे हैं, यू नो ऑल ऑफ देम आर माइग्रेंट्स. सम माइग्रेंट्स हैव कम हियर फॉर 15 years बट दे डोंट हैव एनीथिंग परमानेंट, ऐसे ही रह रहे हैं जैसे एक साल पहले आए हों. तो एक कॉम्प्रहेंसिव डिस्कशन का ज़रूरत है और मैकेनिज्म्स का भी ज़रूरत है. देयर इज़ नो डाउट व्हाट यू a crying need, but let's hope that all the attention that we are trying to bring and civil society at large, we start working on something. In the philanthropy work that we do, we are starting to work with mechanisms of destination and source linkages, कि जब वहाँ से source से निकलें तो visibility हो कि destination में कौन करेगा, कहाँ पे रहेंगे, लेबर कार्ड बने, उनके जो बेसिक सोशल सिक्योरिटी वो मिले. सो इट्स फंडामेंटली वी नीड टू ओवरहॉल और थिंक अबाउट, नॉट इवन ओवरहॉल, देयर इज नो एग्जिस्टिंग सिस्टम. तो उसका ज़रूरत तो है डेफिनेटली. आई एग्री विथ यू, बट क्यों नहीं हो रहा है? आई थिंक वी जस्ट हैव टू कीप पुशिंग.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much for that, wonderful insights and a very hard-hitting presentation. See, now we still don't know what shape this Omicron is going to take, right? Whether it's going to be a huge wave or is it, going to somewhat pass through, let us live, a little more, breathe easy, kind of. So, I want to understand what are the thoughts at the foundation and the partner organizations in terms of the rehabilitation. So far, I mean, we have so actively been involved in relief work. I mean, the kind of vaccination efforts and all it takes, I mean, it's stupendous efforts, right? But now we also have to think about rehabilitation. So I just wanted to understand what kind of thoughts or discussions, if you could, let us know.
Yeah, very important, Annapurna. I mean, the crisis has come and it's laid bare many gaping holes. So for example, just to give you an example, in Bangalore, all the effort that we are putting right now with about 600, close to 600 settlements, which have about 10 lakh populations, we are looking at extending and building a comprehensive kind of engagement with the urban poor, which includes multiple dimensions, starting with access to welfare, entitlement, identity, for migrants, access to basic services, including labor card and everything that comes with those benefits, a certain linkage with the source, services related to health, education, and working on livelihoods as well. So a comprehensive kind of an urban poor effort, which also includes addressing issues of violence, mental health. We already have some components related to the homeless and children in shelters, but building all that together as a comprehensive program for urban poor is really the direction that, that we are taking for Bangalore. And that should be on the ground in the course of this year, in the next in 2022. So, considering we saw what we saw, I think it's time to build it very quickly. That's the plan. That's what is on ground.
Yeah. Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for presenting your research. I think despite what we've been through in the last 2 years, it's very important that this kind of work is done and, we are aware of what's happening. So my question is about philanthropy itself. During COVID itself, a lot of, celebrities and politicians made grand declarations of how much they are donating to COVID relief efforts, etc. Yet, this is the situation. We see that so many people are unemployed, etc., etc. So, my question is that is philanthropy really something, is it a sustained effort? Is it something that can actually change these systemic inequalities? Because that again is leaving welfare at the hands of privileged few people who might or might not want to donate. So, is this really an issue of lack of funds, or is it an issue of lack of redistribution or political willingness to recognize, say, migrant laborers? So yeah, that's my question.
Thanks so much. So there are two ways I'm looking at it from the question that you asked. One is, given that this is still the situation after so much efforts or so many efforts from so many philanthropies or philanthropists, we still are here. So what does philanthropy really, how far does it go? And do we have to therefore look at it systemically, and these efforts will only go that far? The answer to the second is yes. Take any issue, unless and until you address it systemically, you can keep doing some small things, but essentially the core issues will remain. The role of the philanthropy or any organization that is working and engaging with social issues are three kinds. One is essentially to look at gaps that governments are, as the prime duty bearers, they are not able to fulfill for reasons of last mile, not access, not really in sync with the issues of the poor. So therefore, or the particular vulnerability for that example. Therefore, filling those gaps and providing those services when the government is not able to provide, that is one gap-filling kind of role that philanthropies often do. For example, the kind of work with the children shelters, the work we are doing with homeless shelters in Bangalore, homes for elderly poor, work with our disability are people who are extremely vulnerable, and the government is not able to really do as much, and there are many gaps. Having said that, the additional aspect of this work is really to take all these insights, like all that I shared today was coming out of my engagement with the work. There are some researches that we did and drew from that, but essentially seeing it on the ground. So we also have the opportunity and the responsibility to collate all this knowledge and go back and say that, this is what is missing and this is what needs to be constructed or structured. So that is the other role that we also have. So that at a systemic level it can be addressed, and we could still continue to serve the gaps that might forever remain in some cases. The third aspect is also the role of larger civil society. You saw an outpouring of support in the first wave. So many homes, people just cooked something, and there were migrants, in different, just sitting on the road because they didn't have money to pay rent. So you actually had people sitting around police stations because you had to register to get onto a train. There were just people in so many different places near Palace Road and for family in Bangalore. So people are cooking and taking and going. So I think government be as it is and the role that it has, and we need to ensure that we speak truth and we carry data and understanding and insights. We also as civil society need to have a larger consciousness, humaneness, compassion, understanding, and a sense of equity in the way that we look for collective well-being and not just our own well-being. I think whether it is civil society at large or civil society organizations and helping them and strengthening them to do the work. That is another that we all will have to collectively work towards. So I think, yes, there is place for this kind of work, but it is not at the option of another kind, the structure, the more systemic work. And we will need to play a role in all ways.
थैंक यू मैम। जैसे हम देख रहे हैं कि मतलब कोविड के जो इम्पैक्ट्स रहे हैं वो इकोनॉमिकली नहीं है, सोशली भी है, कास्ट हो, रिलीजन हो, वुमेन्स के ऊपर है, चिल्ड्रंस के ऊपर है, मतलब ऑल अक्रॉस द जिस भी लेवल पर जाके देखें कोविड के इम्पैक्ट्स हैं। बट अभी हम देखें तो बस हम एक ही चीज रिकवरी के समय में केवल एक ही चीज पर फोकस है कि भाई इकोनॉमिक रिकवरी, पेपर भरे पड़े हुए हैं कि हम के सेप रिकवरी कर रहे हैं, ये कर रहे हैं, वो कर रहे हैं, लेकिन और मेन स्ट्रीम मीडिया भी देखें तो वो भी मतलब इकोनॉमिक रिकवरी की बात कर रहा है, लेकिन ये सोशल रिकवरी की बात क्यों नहीं हो रही है? ये एक बड़ा क्वेश्चन है। मतलब सोशल रिकवरी जो बहुत ज्यादा इम्पैक्ट है वो क्यों नहीं एड्रेस किया जा रहा है? और मीडिया भी मतलब पूरा उसका जो फोकस है अभी, जो कुछ समय तक पहले तक माइग्रेंट वर्करों को दिखा रही थी, वो भी बिल्कुल वो भूल गई है, जैसे कि मतलब उनको कुछ हुआ भी था। वो सोशल इम्पैक्ट जो हुआ उसकी रिकवरी की बात क्यों नहीं की जा रही?
No, very important and significant point. Like I mentioned in my presentation, that it is important to look at not just economic, which is the easiest because it is quantifiable and visible, but the more underlying, जो ज़्यादा visible भी नहीं है, social and psychological, the mental kind of trauma and the scar that this pandemic has caused. कुछ efforts कुछ governments में चालू हुए हैं, civil society organizations में भी इंक्रीज अवेयरनेस है, जैसे मेंटल हेल्थ का है, जो कम्युनिटीज के हर हिस्सा, मतलब जो अर्बन पुअर के हर कंस्टिट्यूएंट हाई लेवल्स ऑफ मेंटल स्ट्रेस एक्सपीरियंस किए हैं, और वो कंटिन्यू करेगा, क्योंकि ये ऐसा सिचुएशन नहीं है कि आपने एक्सपीरियंस किया, खाना भी नहीं था कुछ दिन के लिए, तो वो उस चीज़ का इम्पैक्ट पड़ता है। तो आई थिंक एफर्ट्स हैव स्टार्टेड, बट देयर इज अ नीड टू डू लॉट मोर एंड पे अटेंशन टू ऑल द एस्पेक्ट्स।
Yeah. Ma'am, in the starting of the in the like ending of the presentation, you said that like the migrant workers come for 3-4 months and they went again to their homes. And if I'm not wrong, you said that we don't have a comprehensive definition of migrants still. So I wonder that can you just elaborate further with it, like what the comprehensive definition you are talking about?
See, you can have technical definitions, huh? So you have circular migration, seasonal migration.
Yeah.
But when somebody uproots themselves for a period of time and comes to the city, there are many different ways that they migrate. For example, the family is behind in their village, but the male member has come, right? The family has come, but the elderly are in the village. One person has come for a few months. The family has come here, but they have been here for 5 years. They have not gone back. But they consider themselves migrants because they have not got assimilated or, socialized in the city at all. वो तो जो शेड में रहते थे वहीं पे रहते हैं। एक कॉन्ट्रैक्टर कंस्ट्रक्शन साइट पे लेके आया और वो कंस्ट्रक्शन खत्म हो गया, तो वो कॉन्ट्रैक्टर सिटी के एक और जगह पे उनको एक और कंस्ट्रक्शन साइट पे लेके खड़ा कर दिया। तो वो माइग्रेंट ही हैं, उनके दिमाग में वो माइग्रेंट ही हैं, वो यहाँ बिलोंग नहीं करते हैं। तो हम जो माइग्रेंट का टेक्निकल डेफिनेशन तो कर सकते हैं कि भाई इफ यू आर कमिंग फॉर दिस टाइम पीरियड एंड एंगेज्ड इन दिस वर्क एंड यू विल गो बैक, लेकिन उतना सिंपल नहीं है। आप ये सब जो नुआंसेस हैं उनको भी आपको इंक्लूड करना पड़ेगा। इट इज ऑल्सो अ साइकोलॉजिकल एस्पेक्ट ऑफ फीलिंग लाइक अ माइग्रेंट ना। आप असिमुलेशन तभी होगा जब उस एस्पेक्ट पे भी हम फोकस करेंगे, ना कि इतना टाइम पीरियड के लिए आप 3 महीने के लिए आते हैं, 6 महीने के लिए आते हैं, वापस जाते हैं। दैट इज अ सिंपलिस्टिक डेफिनेशन। I might be here and feeling like a migrant even after 3-4 years because of the conditions I live in, because of the treatment I'm meted out, because of the exclusion I face, because of the harassment I face in the hands of the authorities. I'm a migrant. It is a condition that is prevalent that we should recognize and incorporate in the definition.
Ma'am, so you talked about the need to create like a just and equitable city. So the need to relook the entire structure of the city right now and sort of reimagine cities. I'm from Bombay, so the most stark difference I can see is in terms of housing, is exactly what you said. People talk about housing most of the time. But I'm wondering, do you have any initial ideas of what this just equitable city might look like? Even if I think about, I also worked in a government school for a few years, so I understand like in terms of education, health, there needs to be more equity. But I'm wondering if that's even possible if all the people in the city don't use similar or same levels of schooling, same kinds of hospitals, which is why I always sort of try and lean into communism then. Because like otherwise, how is it possible? Like who is going to look after that part of the city at all? So do you have any initial ideas of what that city might look like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think it's something that can keep you awake at night. What does that city look like? I think there can be small beginnings. Of course, we all can build an utopia in our head. But to begin with, we say that having a certain basic condition of life is a right. And then we go about thinking how we can provide those basic conditions of well-being, whether it is a physical condition and whether it is an economic condition, whether it is a social condition. We have to acknowledge that it is required for a human being and a citizen. And that is a good starting point from where we can construct, instead of imagining that a city is only for few, that you can ignore, that you can go by ignoring a large part of the city. I think if that beginning can come in the thinking, then the solutions will flow. Essentially, formalizing arrangements is the next step as much as possible, so that again it dovetails into saying when people come and work in any place, be it cities or be it rural, there needs to be a certain security, certain resilience to anything that we do in life. Otherwise, it's high levels of uncertainty leads to high levels of vulnerability. So some of these things have to be hardwired. And then we slowly start building. It's as much about doing certain things like this, and as much about attitudes as well. And unfortunately, inequalities have increased quite starkly in the pandemic. I hope the inequality is only in the money and not in the mind. Because if people start caring less and less and having more and more apathy, I think we can just, we are stumbling towards a more difficult world.
So it's 3:23, 7 minutes more by our time, 2 to 3:30. So if there are some last burning questions that you have in mind, we have a few minutes for. There's one there.
Or anyone wants to share any of your experiences, what you saw.
I'll do both. So I did a research for my undergrad. I did a dissertation, and so it was similar to what you were saying earlier in the beginning of the presentation. So my research was on climate change and reproductive health, and one part of it was about urban flooding. The phenomena that I was looking at was urban flooding. So the literature that I reviewed, it proved that most of the areas that are prone to flooding have lesser rent. So obviously the people who end up living there are people from working classes or socially marginalized people. So that was one thing that, so that is something that has existed even before the pandemic, and of course during the pandemic it became even worse. And then I had a question, or like I was just thinking about it, that the whole concept of citizenship does more harm than good. It's meant to, like, even if we look at the case of the migrant laborers, or if we look at what happened in Maharashtra to laborers from Bihar and UP, so the sense is that we are from here and you are not from here. Like, you are not a citizen of this place, and hence you should not be able to reap benefits of whatever this city has to offer. And even with all of the welfare schemes, you first need to prove that, you know, you do live here, you have lived here for certain years. So I don't understand why that still exists. Like, why is it so prevalent in all of the schemes that we have? Why is it so necessary to prove it? Like, isn't it enough that we are like living and breathing in this land? So isn't that enough to reap benefits or be beneficiaries of these schemes? I mean, that's a very, I know it's a very larger question, but yeah, I was wondering if that came up in your research also about, this feeling of not being citizens of a place and hence feeling more vulnerable in a city.
No, the word citizenship I used from a much larger constitutional values perspective, that we all need to look at ourselves as citizen on the values basis, not on where we live or where we come from, which also might be two different places. I don't know how many of people live in areas where they come from. All of us are constantly moving. Why do we have to prove that we exist? I mean, it was a matter that we discussed with the person who was in charge of relief distribution. I mean, the person is there, right? You can see the person. Why can't you give the packet? Why can't you give the ration? I mean, what is there to see Aadhaar card? Or whatever card for that matter. The Indira canteens, they had to produce their identity. A photo was taken. And then they would be given the packet of pongal or whatever that they were giving. So we went back and said, why does somebody have to provide all that? The government did take back some of that, some of those requirements. But yes, a lot of system is wired into saying, show that you are alive and show that you are here, which is absolutely goes against the concept of, if I'm a citizen, then I am due. When I say citizen, I say it as a larger matter of citizenship as per the constitution, not just I'm from Karnataka. But yes, those regional differences, domicile status, local, non-local, that plays out in different ways in the way that our societies and policies are structured.
Yeah, so my question is related to these philanthropic organizations and some NGOs and their trusts who were actually like other civil societies who came forward to work for these migrant workers, poor, urban poor, domestic, like informal workers and these families. What I saw, this was a personal experience I'm sharing, that there is an organization coming to distribute some ration, and there are other things also, like a basic need for life. While sharing, they come in a big truck which has all the things, and so the vehicle stops in a slum area. They pick few families and they distribute it, click pictures, record videos, they give some speech and go back. And the others have not got it. Few families, so their purpose is resolved, right? That they wanted to distribute something, but the people who have not got it, and now there is another like a larger say organization who is actually mapping that which organization is working in which area. So they've already tapped that, okay, this particular organization has taken care of that particular area. And those people are now excluded because people have not got it. Only 2%, 5% have got it. How these things are seen, who is monitoring it? I mean, we say as a civil society we are doing a lot, but actually on ground it's not reaching. So is there any system of, like in Kerala it's a very nicely built system, but in Bihar it's not. And pandemic kind of thing, no one has experienced. So is there any way to, like any good example?
No, it's important because it happened in the first wave that some families got multiple times, some families never got addressed. Part of the settlement got support, part of it didn't get. The government was also sending support by area, but like I said, they went with say 10,000 food packets, but there were actually 40,000 people. So, you never knew how many people were there, even to plan and take correctly. So that was a reality on the ground because there were just sheer numbers. There was just 30-40 lakh people in Bangalore who were looking for support, and a further 10-15 lakh people who slipped into looking for support because all their jobs were lost. So the numbers were staggering. From the philanthropy, how we organized was that we actually organized our partners by geography. We also went on a saturation approach. So if we go to a settlement, all the houses in the settlement get the support, not that you select by whatever basis, whether it's convenience or it is a certain lens that you have applied. And all that was mapped to ensure that we are covering everyone equitably. Secondly, I think the whole work has to be done with a sense of dignity and compassion and humaneness. You can't go into a settlement and, with all the ration and, make inconvenience people and expect them to, line up randomly and crowding. It's a very inhuman and undignified way of doing. So things that partners would do is essentially go door to door, give a slip, tell them which date and around what time they have to come to a certain point. Partners also organize some kind of a wheelbarrow because वो राशन थोड़ा 20 kg भी हो सकता है ना, तो लेके जाने में भी तकलीफ होता है, तो उनको थोड़ा लेके जाना, and staff to support them to take it, because if an elderly is there, आप उनको support करके घर तक लेके जाइए, और वो टाइम स्लॉट पे आप उनको दीजिए, ना कि वो सुबह से आके खड़े हैं और ऐसा नहीं. तो it was organized in that way, so that we are able to reach it in the right way. So there are ways of doing it, but yes, at a city level it calls for a lot more structured organizing rather than let's do our best kind of approach. It requires a certain level of detail, also a certain approach and attitude to doing this work. We have to build in that into our work. Yeah, that's how we organized our effort at the philanthropy, at the foundation.
Okay, so I'm happy to meet you in person. I heard a lot about you in Dizehalli, and I don't have questions but some comments. And so far, whatever we are discussing about migration, vulnerability, urban poor, and for time and again we have been discussing this in social determinants of health, health systems research. But I think we all need to look at it with reflection and seeing it as an opportunity, because this pandemic has opened this up for us to see that whatever we have been doing, we were not doing mindfully. Because had we treated each other with respect, dignity, equity, this wouldn't have happened. Otherwise, this is an opportunity. I mean, this is my comment overall, because we cannot completely talk about just migrants or social dimension of health or pandemic or, quarantine. Everything is intertwined. And third point that I have, I mean, actually there are part A and B. I work in Dizehalli on a COVID ethnography. And oftentimes it happens that the person, me, I'm a non-local I'm not from Bangalore, I'm not from Karnataka. And I come face to face, when we do research, we often focus on the subject. But it is so difficult to keep yourself away from it, because we are also having the same questions. I don't follow any language other than my limited understanding of Hindi and English and maybe some other languages. And I remember this, when the COVID was at its peak, we needed those passes to travel. And oftentimes we had to do this crawl down, there's no way to write on your own. And I would always fill the word migrant, because I'm not a doctor. How do you go between two states of Karnataka and Maharashtra, for example? So, when we're discussing this migrant, it is not necessarily the poor. It is also how the system is looking at this dimension. Oftentimes not knowing migration is such an in thing and such a dynamic thing, and it is not like, it is like how we're missing that aspect for an urban or rural or any structure for that matter. Thank you. It was really nice listening to you.
Yeah, an absolutely wonderful note to end on as well. Thank you so much. I think it's a point that all of us should ponder in our daily lives as well. So it's as much a question to each one of us as for governments and civil society at large. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was wonderful to come to our university. It's a lovely campus. Hope I'll come back again soon as well. Thanks. Thanks so much, Himanshu.
Thanks, Hema, and thanks to everyone who is sitting here. Just one small request to my students from MA Development, to the other students from the other programs at university. Every Friday we have this colloquium, and every Friday I hope that the 20 who have come up will all bring 10 each, so the next time the whole will have 200. Please please help me get more and more listeners. And again, it's not a passive listening, correct? It's a Q&A which went on for quite some time. We are at 3:34 and we are closing it with a hope that you would have enjoyed this and you would definitely work on this request. Because एक हाथ से नहीं होता है ना. Thank you.